Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Chandler from the English Department and the Department of Cinema Media Studies and the Franke Institute. I couldn't be happier to be introducing the third of this year's Berlin lectures delivered in 2015 by Amitav Ghosh. When Randy and Melvin Berlin, the eponymous benefactors of the series, first proposed such a thing some years ago, they encouraged us to dream big in planning it. As we come to the midpoint of Amitav Ghosh's 4 lectures, I can only say that they have so far matched our wildest dreams. We not only have in our midst a world-class writer working at the height of his powers on a topic of great moment and complexity in a format that allows him to do it justice, we also have the promise of a book that will make a real difference to the world beyond us here in this place who are privileged to witness its first working out. With today's lecture, we pivot from fiction to history. Ghosh has so far argued that the dominant form of fiction that was consolidated after the Enlightenment, especially among Anglo-American and European writers, is singularly ill-suited to represent the conditions of the Anthropocene era. The familiar novel of consciousness and everyday life focuses our attention on what Updike called the moral adventure of an individual character. It leaves little room, Ghosh has noted, for the great storms we face in our time, or for the wider world of natural beings and forces they disrupt. Jane Austen has been more than once mentioned by Ghosh as an avatar of this tradition. At one point, he even provocatively speculated whether the green lawns we associate with her novels, or say with those of Henry James, might not be partly responsible for a modern world picture that leads to the squandering of water resources in the arid suburbs of Southern California. But the invocation of Jane Austen can serve to remind us of another author of her moment who proved even more influential than she on world fiction. This other author, Sir Walter Scott, partially, I emphasize partially, anticipates Ghosh's work, especially in the marvelous Ibis trilogy on the Opium Wars. Consider what Scott wrote about his then far less celebrated contemporary in 1826. Read again, and for the third time at least, Miss Austen's very finely written novel of Pride and Prejudice. That young lady has a talent for describing the involvements and feelings and characters of ordinary life, which is to me the most wonderful I've ever met with. The big bow-wow strain I can do myself, like any now going, but the exquisite touch which renders ordinary commonplace things and characters interesting from the truth of the description and sentiment is denied to me. Ghosh's Ibis trilogy seems to me one of the most ambitious contemporary heirs of the big bow-wow strain, the novel that returns fiction to its genealogy in the epic. Scott himself said he was attempting to fashion the modern epopee, and his success shaped the work of some of the greatest novels produced in the 19th century. The Big Bow Wow offered a kind of fiction that did not exclude the big world with its play of great forces. And, apropos of Ghosh's topic, it did so. In doing so, it challenged historians how best to capture it. The challenge lay in Scott's very deliberate efforts to combine attention to ordinary life and to the great affairs of history. 2 years after Scott's comment about Austen, the young Thomas Babington Macaulay, who had become a great historian himself, summoned the historians of his own moment to emulate Scott's practice, likening the historian's take on the past to the traveler in a foreign country. Historians before Scott, he says, are like travelers who confine their observations to palaces on solemn days. Instead, they must see ordinary men as they appear in their ordinary business and their ordinary pleasures. Nor must he, quote, shrink from exploring even the retreats of misery. And the historian who wishes to understand the condition of mankind in former ages must proceed on the same principle. For Macaulay, Scott's innovation with the historical novel in the years after 1814 exemplifies that principle. It uses fictional extrapolations based on serious research to represent the obscure underside of history, where changing conditions of life are lived and felt. Amitav Ghosh has been able to reanimate that supremely important and badly neglected series of events we call the Opium Wars, in part because of his application of Scott's principle to the representation of them. It is one thing to be told in the abstract that, in order to rectify the imbalance of trade created by Britain's long-standing addiction to tea, the East India Company capitalized hundreds of square miles of land on the plain of the Ganges and then converted it to poppy production for the manufacture of opium to be shipped to Canton for increasingly addicted Chinese people. It is another to see, near the start of the Ibis trilogy, the focalizing character of the peasant Diti, whose land has been capitalized for opium production, making her way to the Sutter opium factory in Gazipur in an effort to collect her doomed husband, a casualty of the new system. She crosses ground once checkered with rice fields and other sustaining crops, but now covered with poppies, a landscape made toxic by the byproduct of this precious new commodity. The poison saturates even the air she breathes. Ghosh writes of leaves, stalks, and roots used in the packaging of the drug that, when ground up for storage, produced a fine dust that hung in the air like a fog of snuff. This encounter of private life and historical atmosphere is the stuff of the big bow wow, all right. But in connection with a writer like Ghosh, it's impossible to mention Macaulay without acknowledging the latter's India connection, without noting, that is, that Macaulay moved to Ghosh's native Calcutta in 1833, 5 years after his comments on Scott, also 5 years before the date of the Ibis trilogy, and that Macaulay became an apologist for the East India Company that, in that very same year, lost its charter and needed a new justification. Macaulay appreciated Scott's sensitivity to ordinary lives in the past, but in the light of a global historical imagination like Ghosh's, Macaulay's mid-1830s writings on Indian government and on Indian education stand revealed in all their provincially European limitations. Ghosh's gift is to be able to render not just the top and the bottom of an historical moment, but its many sides and many perspectives, from Calcutta to Bombay to Canton to Hong Kong to Mauritius to London to Baltimore. It is a rare gift. It is, among other things, a historian's gift. Please welcome back Amitav Ghosh for the third of his lectures on the Great Derangement.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that very generous introduction. I'd also like to thank once again Randy and Melvin Berlin and the Berlin family for making these lectures possible. It's been a real gift to be able to do this, and I'm really grateful to them for having this opportunity. I've been very lucky also in having had the support of my wife, Deborah Baker, who's also here today. And it's been, she was one of the first readers of these lectures, and I'm really glad that she could be here today. I've also had completely by chance, another of the first readers of these lectures, who's an urban activist, Rahul Srivastav, and also our neighbor in Goa. He's here too, and I'm very, very grateful that he could make the time. For all these things, it's always good to have support, and I feel really grateful that it's been possible here. In accounts of the present climate crisis, capitalism is very often the pivot on which the narrative turns. Nor is this a matter of dispute as far as I'm concerned. To me, it's perfectly self-evident that capitalism lies at the heart of the climate crisis. However, I believe that this narrative often overlooks an aspect of the Anthropocene that is of equal importance: empire and imperialism. While capitalism and empire are certainly dual aspects of a single reality, the relationship between them is not, and has never been, a simple one. In relation to global warming, I think it's demonstrable that the imperatives of capital and empire have often pushed in different directions, producing some unexpected results. To look at the climate crisis through the prism of empire is to recognize, firstly, that the continent of Asia is conceptually critical to every aspect of global warming, its causes, its philosophical and historical implications, and to the possibility of a global response to it. It takes only a moment's thought for this to be obvious. Yet, strangely, the implications are rarely taken full account of. The reasons why Asia is central to the crisis, therefore, do need to be spelled out in some detail, even if it's at the cost of stating the obvious. Asia's centrality to global warming rests, in the first instance, upon numbers. The significance of this is perhaps most readily apparent in relation to the future. That is to say, if we consider the sum of lives and livelihoods that are threatened by the impact of the currently ongoing changes in the climate. There can be little doubt that of the many millions on the planet whose lives and livelihoods are under immediate threat because of global warming, the majority are in Asia. This is largely because of the amplificatory effect of the continent's numbers. Take, for instance, the Bengal Delta, a region that consists of most of Bangladesh and much of the Indian state of West Bengal. Formed by the confluence of two of the world's mightiest rivers, the Ganga and the Brahmaputra, this is one of the most densely populated parts of the world, with more than 250 million people living in an area of about a quarter the size of Nigeria. Although this region is essentially a low-lying floodplain, it is not as much at risk of immediate submersion as, say, the Pacific island nation of Tuvalu. But the population of Tuvalu is less than 10,000, and the partial inundation of just one island in Bangladesh, Bhola Island, has led to the displacement of more than 500,000 people. Moreover, in Bengal, as in other Asian deltas, like those of the Irrawaddy, the Indus, and the Mekong, the effects of sea level rise are magnified by another factor. Deltaic regions across Asia, and elsewhere in the world as well, are subsiding much faster than oceans are rising. This is due partly to geological processes and partly to human activities, such as the extraction of groundwater and oil, and upstream damming, which greatly reduces the flow and deposition of silt. Again, Asian populations are particularly vulnerable, with the deltas of the Chao Phraya, the Krishna Godavari, the Ganges Brahmaputra, and the Indus being especially badly affected. Along with Bangladesh, Vietnam is at the top of the list of countries threatened by sea level rise. In the event of a 1 meter rise in sea levels, 10.8% of its population will be displaced. Asia's coasts are not alone in facing dire threats. In the interior of the continent as well, millions of lives and livelihoods are already in jeopardy because of droughts, periodic flooding, extreme weather events, and so on. No less than 24% of India's arable land is slowly turning into desert. In China, which feeds more than 20% of the world's population, of 7% of the world's arable land, desertification is already causing direct annual losses of $65 billion. But fearsome as these risks are, they are dwarfed by the hazards posed by the dwindling of the glaciers of Tibet and the Himalaya. The waters that are stored there in the form of accumulations of ice sustain half the world's population. If the glaciers of the Tibetan Plateau continue to shrink at the present rate, the most populous parts of Asia will face catastrophic water shortages within a decade or two. In terms of numbers, the consequences are beyond imagining. 500 million people in South and Southeast Asia are at risk. It is the matter of numbers, again, that makes Asia critical to the questions of mitigation, preparedness, and resiliency. The brute fact is that no strategy can work globally unless it works in Asia and is adopted by large numbers of Asians. Yet, in this matter too, the conditions that are peculiar to mainland Asia are often absent from the discussion. The vulnerability of Asia's populations is only one aspect of their centrality to global warming. The reality is that the continent has also played a pivotal role in setting in motion the chain of consequences that is driving the present cycle of climate change. In this story, too, numbers are critical, for it was the rapid and expanding industrialization of Asia's most populous nations, beginning in the 1980s, that has brought the crisis to a head. Numbers are critical again to the difference in Asia's role in global warming and that of the West. The West's contribution to the accumulation of greenhouse gases came about through the continuous expansion of the carbon footprint of what was about 30% of the world's population at the middle of the 20th century. Asia's contribution, on the other hand, came about through a sudden but very small expansion in the footprints of a much larger number of people, perhaps as much as half of the world's population, late in the 20th century. To be sure, the planet would have faced a climate crisis sooner or later, even if the history of mainland Asia had not taken this turn. After all, signs of a changing climate date back to the 1930s, and the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere had already passed 300 parts per million when Charles Keeling began to take measurements at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. This was in the late 1950s, long before the economies of mainland Asia began their rapid acceleration. Even back then, the carbon footprint of the West was growing rapidly enough to ensure that the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere would continue to rise. But that rise would not have been so dramatic if several countries, led by the 4 Asian tigers, had not launched upon a period of sustained economic expansion. It is this acceleration that has dramatically shortened the time available to adapt to, or even to recognize, the crisis for what it is. But apart from its dual role as both protagonist and victim, Asia has played yet another critical part in the unfolding of the Great Derangement. It is that of the simpleton who, in his blundering progress across the stage, unwittingly stumbles upon the secret that is the key to the plot. This is because certain crucial aspects of modernity would not have become apparent if they had not been put to an empirical test in the only continent where the magnitudes of population are such that they can literally move the planet. And as with any truly revelatory experiment, the results would not have been believed by Asians or anyone else if they had not turned out exactly as they have. For the results are counterintuitive, and they contradict all the tenets on which our lives, thoughts, and actions have been based for almost a century. This is that the patterns of life that modernity engenders are such that they can only be practiced by a small minority of the world's population. Asia's historical experience has demonstrated that the planet we live on is so constituted that it imposes certain material constraints which will not allow these patterns of living to be adopted by every human being on this planet. Every family in the world cannot have 2 cars, a washing machine, a refrigerator, and so on, not because they cannot be produced, but because we would all asphyxiate in the process. It is Asia, then, that has torn the mask from the phantom that lured it onto the stage of the Great Derangement, but only to recoil in horror at its own handiwork. Its shock is such that it dare not even name what it has beheld. For having entered the stage, it is trapped like everyone else. All it can say to the chorus that is waiting to receive it is, "But you promised, and we believed you." In this role as horror-struck simpleton, Asia has also laid bare, through its own silence, the silences that are now ever more plainly evident at the heart of global systems of governance. If it is indeed the case that the climate crisis was precipitated by mainland Asia's embrace of the dominant mechanisms of the world economy, then the critical question in relation to the history of the Anthropocene is this: why did the most populous countries of Asia industrialize late in the 20th century and not before? Strangely, this question is almost never explicitly posed in accounts of the history of global warming. Yet these accounts do often offer an implicit answer. It is that the non-Western world was slow to enter the carbon economy because the technologies that created it were Occidental inventions. Thus, for example, the volcanologist Bill Maguire cites 1769 as a key date in the history of the Anthropocene because that was the year when Richard Arkwright invented the spinning jenny, a machine that would serve as a critical link in the transition to carbon-intensive forms of production. For Timothy Morton, on the other hand, the key moment is April 1784, a date about which he asserts we can be uncannily precise because that was when James Watt patented the steam engine. These accounts are, of course, consistent with the history of global warming as it was to develop over the 19th and 20th centuries, when the carbon-intensive economies of the West pumped greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at ever-accelerating rates. It is therefore perfectly accurate to state, as Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan did in their seminal 1991 essay on climate justice, that, I quote, the accumulation in the atmosphere of greenhouse gases is mainly the result of the gargantuan consumption of the developed countries, particularly the United States, unquote. This precisely was the actual outcome of the carbon economy's trajectory of development under a circumstance of absolute political and military domination of the world by the West. Such being the case, it is true also, as Pope Francis recently reiterated, that the industrialized nations of the West owe an enormous carbon debt to the global South. Yet, these self-evident truths should not lead us to overlook the fact that the carbon economy of the 19th and 20th centuries had a prehistory that was, in fact, extremely complicated. There is now a great deal of research to suggest that the early modern period, roughly the 16th to the early 19th centuries, was a time of rapid and often parallel change around much of the world, and particularly so across the Eurasian landmass. One particularly striking instance of this is the process of vernacularization of languages, which, as Sheldon Pollock has demonstrated, proceeded almost in tandem in Europe and the Indian subcontinent. The stimulus may also have been the same in both instances, consisting of forces set in motion by the Islamic expansion. This was also a period in which ideas and technologies circulated with great rapidity. In the 16th century, European innovations in the design of fortifications were being incorporated into forts in peninsular India within 10 years of their introduction in Italy. Innovations in mathematics may have traveled in the other direction. It has been argued, for example, that advances made by the Kerala School of Mathematics in calculus and spherical geometry were transmitted to Europe by Jesuits in the 16th century. In at least one instance, that of the logician and mathematician George Boole, the connection was explicitly acknowledged. Boole's wife, Mary Everest Boole, even made the claim that 19th century European science could, I quote, could never have reached its present height had it not been fertilized by successive wafts from the knowledge stored up in the East, unquote. Philosophy provides a particularly striking example, both of parallel developments and of the circulation of ideas. As Janardhan Ganeri has shown, the innovations of the Navanyaya school of philosophy in Bengal contain striking similarities to the thought of early modern philosophers in Europe. As for circulation, Muslim, Jain, and Hindu philosophers in India were familiar with the ideas of Descartes by the early 1660s, barely 10 years after his death. A major figure in the transmission and circulation of these ideas was the French traveler, François Bernier, who had studied with the important early modern thinker, Pierre Gassendi. Bernier translated the works of Gassendi as well as Descartes into Persian while he was in India and Iran. This was in the 16th century. So great was the ferment of this period, writes Ganeri, that, quote, India in the 17th century was in intellectual overdrive. Muslim, Jain, and Hindu intellectuals produced works of tremendous vitality, and ideas circulated around India through the Persianate and Arabic worlds and out to Europe and back. In short, as the historian Sanjay Subramaniam has long argued, modernity was not a virus that spread from the West to the rest of the world. It was rather a, I quote, global and conjunctural phenomenon, unquote, with many iterations arising almost simultaneously in different parts of the world. That such a possibility might exist had long been obscured by one of the distinctive features of Western modernity, its insistence on its own uniqueness. Yet even this insistence has usually been suspended in relation to one case, that of Japan, of which it was widely accepted that it had its own unique variant of modernity. Subramaniam has suggested that the exception was made because Japan's bank balance made it a credible vision. Now, with the swelling of the bank balances of India, China, and many other nations, it will perhaps soon come to be recognized that the early modern era nurtured not one or two, but multiple modernities. The fact that much of this ferment was set in motion during a period of great climatic disruption, the 17th century, opens the door to a possibility that the changes of the early modern era were to a significant degree influenced by shifts in climate, which had varying effects in different parts of the planet. That the West was ultimately able to seize the opportunities of that time and thereby establish complete global dominance was by no means a predetermined outcome. Here again, climate may sometimes have tipped the balance. It has been suggested, for instance, that the expansion of the British East India Company in Bengal was aided by a series of climate-induced droughts between the 1760s and 1820s. John Brooke suggests this in his book on climate and history. Where it concerns human beings, it is almost always true that the more anxiously we look for purity, the more likely we are to come upon admixture and interbreeding. This is no less true, I think, of the genealogy of the carbon economy than it is of the human race. Here too lies a story that ties together many tangled strands. To disentangle this skein in its entirety is far beyond my abilities. The best I can hope to do is to point to some of the strands that I have chanced upon myself in the course of my work as a writer. The first of these strands leads to China by a route that provides a graphic view of the intricate interconnections between coal, oil, natural gas, and a carbon source that predates all others. This is wood, which also needs to be reckoned with in any genealogy of the Anthropocene. This narrative begins about 1,000 years ago, during China's medieval economic revolution, an episode that may itself have had a complex relationship with climatic variations. Deforestation was so extensive in this period that the resulting runoff of silt actually altered China's coastline, leading to the filling in and expansion of the deltas of the Pearl, Yellow, and Yangtze rivers. By the 11th century, the shortage of wood was such that the people of northern Jiangsu province were overjoyed to learn of the discovery of coal in their region. This prompted the poet Su Dongpu to write the following lines in 1087. That a rich inheritance lay in their hills was something they did not know. Lovely black rock in abundance, 10,000 cartloads of coal. It'll be clear from this that China's coal economy has a history that goes back at least 1,000 years. But the Chinese were pioneers in the use of other fossil fuels as well. This is what the late 18th century classic of the waterways of Sichuan has to say about the use and extraction of oil and natural gas in that province. Quote, natural gas can be used as a fuel to boil brine, steam rice, calcine limestone to make lime, or to smother burn wood to convert it to charcoal. When it is drawn through an opening in a bamboo tube to serve as a substitute for firewood or candles, this aperture is smeared with clay. Thus it burns hotly at the mouth, but the bamboo does not catch fire. At other times, it is drawn off into the bladder of a pig, the opening sealed, and the bladder placed inside a box or bag that one can take home with one. When night falls, one pierces a hole with a needle, applies an ordinary domestic flame, and the fire will come out of the bladder and light up the room. There are also oil wells. The color of the oil is turbid, but it burns well, and one can have a fire anywhere. It will not diminish or go out in wind or rain, or even when plunged into water. If one is traveling at night and stores oil in a bamboo tube, it is possible to travel for 1 or 2 kilometers on a single tube. Such wells are commonplace and no cause for astonishment. It's wonderful to imagine, houses in China being lit with bladders of natural gas and people traveling with bamboo tubes full of oil. Mark Elvin, from whose book The Retreat of the Elephants these excerpts are taken, notes, quote, parts of this region of late pre-modern China not only used gas for industrial processes, but had domestic gas cookers, domestic gas lighting, and a primitive form of mobile illumination using bottled oil, all based on bamboo tubing. Once again, there is something of the feel of an emerging modern economy about this technical vigor and virtuosity, unquote. The story of China's relationship with carbon fuels suggests that a part of the responsibility for the adoption of these fuels must go to the Earth itself, in the sense that climatic variations, coupled with demographic changes, may have necessitated a search for new sources of energy at different moments in different parts of the globe. Thanks to new climate-attentive histories, it is now known that the Earth and its atmosphere have often taken a hand in tipping the balance of power amongst human beings. It is even possible, as I've noted before, that non-human agencies have sometimes intervened in human processes of thought. Timothy Morton takes this analogy still further and describes his own processes of thought as, I quote, a mental translation of climate, biosphere, evolution, unquote. This is why it is all the more striking that in picking 1784 as a date of birth for the Anthropocene, Morton shuts the door to the possibility that the emergence of the carbon economy may have been due in part to non-human interventions that played out in different ways in different parts of the Earth. It is as if the lessons of the Anthropocene are being lost even as they're being discovered. The discourse on the subject sometimes seems to fall unwittingly into collusion with that aspect of Western modernity that seeks to conceal its linkages with other genealogies of thought and technique. The second strand in my alternative history of the carbon economy leads to 19th century Burma and a place that takes its name from a foul-smelling rivulet. The name is Yenangyang. This is how I described it in my novel, The Glass Palace. Quote, this was one of the few places in the world where petroleum rose naturally to the surface of the earth. Long before the discovery of the internal combustion engine, there was already a good market for this oil. Merchants came to Yenangyang from as far away as China to avail themselves of this substance. The gathering of the oil was the work of a community endemic to those burning hills, a group of people known as Twinzas, a tight-knit, secretive bunch of outcasts, runaways, and foreigners. This description is of Yenangyang as it was in the latter years of the 19th century. But the history of Burma's oil industry goes back much further, possibly even a millennium or more. Oil from natural springs, sinks, and hand-dug pits has, of course, been in use in many parts of the world since ancient times. But the early oil industry of Burma was, in all likelihood, the largest in the world. The oil wells of Yenangyang caught the attention of British travelers as early as 1755. Major Michael Symes, an East India Company envoy to the court of Ava, near Mandalay, published this description of it in 1795, I quote, after passing various sands and villages, we got to Yenangyang, or earth oil, Petroleum Creek. We were informed that the celebrated wells of petroleum, which supplied the empire of Ava and many parts of India with that useful product, were 5 miles to the east of this place. The mouth of the creek was crowded with large boats waiting to receive a lading of oil, and immense pyramids of earthen jars were raised within and around the village. We saw several thousand jars filled with it ranged along the bank. The earth oil of Yenangyang had many uses. It was applied on the skin as a remedy for certain conditions and was also used as an insecticide, a lubricant for cartwheels, as a caulking agent in boat building, and even as a preservative for palm leaf manuscripts. But its principal use was as a fuel for lamps. In 1826, a British official was told that 2/3 of the oil of Yenangyang served that purpose. It was this form of illumination that sustained the nighttime pues, or festivals that were and still are so beloved of the Burmese. For Burma's ruling Konbaung dynasty, the oil industry was a major source of revenue even in the 18th century, which was one reason why British envoys took a special interest in the substance. But oil became specially important after the Second Anglo-Burmese War of 1852 to 53, when the British seized the southern province of Pegu, depriving the then ruler, King Mindon, of a very rich source of revenue. In 1854, King Mindon did what the rulers of many modern petrostates were to do in the century to come. He asserted direct control over the oil fields of Yanangyang, effectively nationalizing the industry. After this, producers could sell only to the state, and King Mindon was able to dictate prices. At the same time, the king also took steps to create links with the world market by entering into contracts with an English firm which manufactured paraffin candles. Soon, Price's Patent Candle Company Limited was importing as much as 2,000 barrels of Burmese oil per month. This amounted to more than half of the yearly production of the Yanangyang oil fields, which was in the range of 46,000 barrels. The king further consolidated his relationship with the oil industry by marrying the daughter of a leading well owner, thereby acquiring control of over 120 oil wells. He would soon acquire many more through mortgages and through the digging of new wells. King Mindon is also said to have created a refinery in Mandalay in the mid-19th century, where oil was stored and processed. These and other interventions brought about a twofold increase in oil production in Burma between 1862 and 1876. In light of this, it could be said that the first steps towards the creation of a modern oil industry were actually taken in Burma. But where these steps might have led, we do not know, because Burma's attempts to control its oil came to an abrupt end in 1885, when the British invaded and annexed the remnants of the Konbaung realms, deposing Thibaw, the dynasty's last king. After that, the oil fields of Yanangyang passed into British control, and in time they became the nucleus of the mega corporation that was known until the 1960s as Burma Shell. But throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the twin Tsars of Yanangyang continued to play a major role in exploiting the oil fields of the region. They do so to this day. In 19th century British sources, the unfortunate Konbaungs were often represented as indolent, corrupt, and backward. But as the historian Thant Mintyu has shown, the late Konbaungs, even the doomed Thibaw, were in their own fashion trying hard to stay abreast in matters of technology. They introduced the telegraph, imported steam-powered vessels, enacted administrative reforms of many kinds, encouraged manufacturing industries, tried to build railways, and created scholarships to educate students in France and England. They also exerted themselves to improve animal welfare in line with Buddhist teachings. At King Mindon's behest, a number of wildlife sanctuaries were established in the Burmese kingdom from the 1850s onwards. There is no reason to suppose that Burma would have been unable to navigate the emerging petroleum economy had it been free to do so. Certainly in the mid-19th century, no part of the world had more experience in the production of oil than Burma. It will be clear from this that, as with much else that bears the label of modern, the development of the oil industry in Burma was a profoundly hybrid process involving local rulers, officialdom, and businessmen, not to speak of technologies that dated back many centuries. Yet, as the historian Marilyn Longmuir notes, quote, most oil historians give the date 28 August 1859 as the commencement of the modern oil industry, when Colonel Edwin L. Drake organized the first successful drilling of an oil well at Oil Creek near Titusville, Pennsylvania, unquote. Here again is an instance of Western modernity's enormous intellectual commitment to the promotion of its supposed singularity. The third strand of these alternative histories leads back to certain key moments in the inauguration of India's carbon economy. The first steam-powered vessel to operate in India was a dredger on the Hooghly River. The vessel's engine is said to have been sent from Birmingham to Calcutta in 1817 or 1818, a decade or so after Robert Fulton made history by launching the first commercial steamboat on the Hudson River in 1807. The first marine steam engines to see commercial service in India were purchased by a group of Calcutta businessmen from a British trader in Canton, China, in 1823. The two engines were mounted on a locally built vessel which was launched upon the Hooghly, which is the river in Calcutta, under the name Diana. Although the Diana attracted much attention, the venture was a commercial failure. Around this time, several steam engines were also built in Calcutta. The skills for the making and maintenance of these machines were abundantly available in and around the city. A historian of Indian steamships notes, quote, "The Ganges Valley villages were teeming with men whose skills in their own traditional technology were roughly similar to those needed to keep a steam flotilla in service," unquote. This anticipated an important but little-known aspect of the age of steam. It was India that provided much of the manpower for the boiler rooms of the world's merchant fleets. Already in the early 1820s, businessmen in India, foreign and local, had become keenly interested in the possibility of a regular steamer service between England and India. Since no coal-fueled vessel had yet made that journey, a conglomerate of wealthy men, a group that included the Nawab of Awadh, announced a prize of £10,000 for the first steamship to complete the voyage in less than 70 days. The challenge was taken up by a group of investors in England, and a side-wheel steamship called Enterprise, this is a name that recurs often amongst early steamships, was built at Deptford at a cost of £43,000. The Enterprise left Falmouth on August 16th, 1825, and arrived in Calcutta on December 7th, after a voyage of 114 days. So it missed its target, but it was given the prize anyway. Indian businessmen were quick to recognize the possibilities of the new technology. Dwarkanath Tagore, whose grandson, the poet Rabindranath Tagore, would win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913, is a key figure in the history of India's carbon economy. In the late 18th century, at a time when, quote, British investment in Bengal was insignificant, unquote, he was one of a number of local businessmen who took the initiative in building a commercial infrastructure. He was also a visionary in regard to the carbon economy. Not only did he set up the Calcutta Steam Tug Association, he was one of the earliest promoters of railways in India. In 1836, Tagore bought the Raniganj coalfields in Bihar, thereby becoming one of the principal suppliers of coal in Bengal. But this venture eventually failed, not because it was inherently flawed, but because it was consistently undermined by the East India Company, which preferred to import coal from England despite the high cost. On the other side of the subcontinent, in Bombay, indigenous merchants were equally enthusiastic about the new technology. In some ways, they were in a better position to respond to it because Bombay's shipbuilding industry dated back to the mid-18th century. The Bombay dockyard, owned by the Wadia family, was particularly successful and was able to compete effectively with the most famous shipyards of Europe and the United States. The Wadia's reputation was such that they obtained many contracts from the Royal Navy. It was their shipyard that built the Cornwallis, on which the Treaty of Nanking was signed in 1842. But it was the very success of Bombay's shipyards that was their undoing. The English shipping industry began to complain that the families of all the shipwrights in England are certain to be reduced to starvation unless India-built ships were barred from accessing British ports. In 1815, the British Parliament passed a law, the Registry Act, that placed tight restrictions on Indian ships and sailors. It has been said of this law that it was more devastating to the economy of Indian shipping than all the competitive technological innovations of the last 300 years put together. It's worth recalling here that shipbuilding was at the leading edge of industrial innovation in the 18th and 19th centuries. Shipbuilders had to respond swiftly to technological advances of all kinds for both commercial and military reasons. These improvements were often prominently on display in the vessels that put into Bombay's shipyards for repairs. The city's shipwrights and artisans were therefore well placed to stay abreast of technological innovations from elsewhere. Bombay's shipbuilders were not slow to respond to the challenges of steam technology. In 1830, master builder Nauroji Jamsetji Wadia launched a steamer, the Hugh Lindsay, that was fitted with 2 engines sent out from England. But he was outdone by his relative, the engineer Ardesir Karsetji Wadia, who entered into apprenticeship in the Bombay dockyard at the age of 14 in 1822 and was eventually elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. He wrote in his memoirs, I quote, "My enthusiastic love of science now led me to construct, unassisted, a small steam engine of about 1 horsepower. I likewise endeavored to explain to my countrymen the nature and properties of steam, and to effect this point, I had constructed at a great expense in England a marine steam engine, which being sent out to Bombay, I succeeded with the assistance of a native blacksmith in fixing in a boat of my own building, unquote. Through the 1820s and 30s, Indian steamers were built of wood, but in 1839, Bombay's Mazagon docks launched an iron steamer, the Comet. But in the end, it was not steam, but iron that proved to be an insuperable obstacle for Indian shipbuilders. They were unable to compete internationally because there was no local steel industry. More to the point, the coal economy could not have taken hold in India at that point in time, simply because India was a British colony. The appetites of the fossil-powered economy of the metropole needed to be fed by large quantities of raw materials produced by solar-based methods of agriculture. Had a fossil economy developed synchronously in India and elsewhere, then these materials would have been used locally, that is to say, in India. Hence, the emerging fossil economies of the West required that people elsewhere be prevented from developing coal-based energy systems of their own, by compulsion, if necessary. As Tim Mitchell observes, the coal economy thus essentially depended on not being imitated. Imperial rule assured that it was not. It was not for any lack of industriousness then, or ingenuity, or entrepreneurial interest, that this avatar of the carbon economy withered in India. The matter might have taken a completely different turn if local industrialists had enjoyed the kind of state patronage that was routinely extended to their competitors elsewhere. The lesson of these alternative histories is this: the factor that gave a decisive shape to the global carbon economy was that the European powers had already established a strong, but by no means hegemonic, military and political presence in much of Asia and Africa at the time when the technology of steam was in its nascency, that is to say, the late 18th and early 19th centuries. From that point on, carbon-intensive technologies were to have the effect of continually reinforcing Western power. That pattern was established in the First Opium War, in which armored steamships, led by the aptly named Nemesis, were to play a decisive role. In other words, carbon emissions were, from very early on, closely correlated to power in all its aspects. This continues to be, as I shall argue tomorrow, a crucial but unacknowledged factor in the politics of global warming. The Opium War of 1840-42 was the first important conflict to be fought in the name of free trade and unfettered markets. Yet, ironically, the most obvious lesson of this period is that capitalist trade and industry cannot thrive without access to military and political power. State interventions have always been critical to its advancement. In effect, military dominance created the conditions in which Western capital could prevail over indigenous commerce. And British imperial officials of that period understood perfectly well what this meant. It was that the maintenance of military dominance had to be the primary imperative of empire. In mainland Asia, the crucial relationship between economy, political sovereignty, and military power was not restored till the process of decolonization was set in motion by the end of the Second World War. It is surely no coincidence that the acceleration of mainland Asian economies followed within a few decades. As Dipesh Chakraborty points out, the period of the Great Acceleration is precisely, I quote, the period of great decolonization in countries that had been dominated by European imperial powers, and that made a move towards modernization over the ensuing decades. Such being the case, the essential question in relation to the chronology of global warming is this: what would have happened if decolonization and the dismantling of empires, including that of Japan, had occurred earlier, say after the First World War? Would the economies of mainland Asia have accelerated earlier? If the answer to this were yes, then another equally important question would arise. Could it be that imperialism actually delayed the onset of the climate crisis by retarding the expansion of Asian and African economies? Is it possible that if the major 20th century empires had been dismantled earlier, then the landmark figure of 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would have been crossed long before it actually was. It seems to me that the answer is almost certainly yes. This is indeed silently implied in the positions that India, China, and many other nations have taken in global climate negotiations. The argument about fairness in relation to per capita emissions is, in a sense, an argument about lost time. Here, then, is the paradoxical possibility that is implied by these positions. The fact that some of the key technologies of the carbon economy were first adopted in England may actually have retarded the onset of the climate crisis. To acknowledge the complexity of the history of the carbon economy does not in any way diminish the force of the argument for global justice regarding greenhouse gas emissions. To the contrary, it places the argument within the same contexts as debates about inequality, poverty, and social justice within countries like Britain and the United States. It is to assert that the poor of the world are not poor because they were indolent or unwilling. Their poverty is the result of systems that were set up by the exercise of power to ensure that they remained always at a disadvantage in terms of both wealth and power. Inasmuch as the fruits of the carbon economy constitute wealth, and inasmuch as the poor of the global south have been historically deprived of this wealth, it is certainly true by every available canon of distributive justice that they are entitled to a greater share of the rewards of that economy. But even to enter into that argument is to recognize how deeply we are mired in the great derangement. Our lives and our choices are enframed in a pattern of history that seems to leave us nowhere to turn but towards our own self-annihilation. A conception of justice that excludes the claims of the non-human will be contested not in any human court, but by the retribution of the earth itself. Imperialism was not, however, the only obstacle in Asia's path to industrialization. This model of economy also met with powerful indigenous resistance of many different kinds. Of course, industrial capitalism met with resistance everywhere, not least in Europe. But in Asia, that resistance was often articulated and championed by figures of extraordinary moral and political authority, such as Mahatma Gandhi. Among his best-known pronouncements on industrial capitalism are these famous lines written in 1928. I quote, "God forbid that India should ever take to industrialism after the manner of the West. If an entire nation of 300 millions took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the world bare like locusts." This quote is striking because of the directness with which it goes to the heart of the matter, numbers. It is proof that Gandhi, like many others, understood intuitively what Asia's history would eventually demonstrate, that the universalist premise of industrial civilization was a delusion, that a consumerist mode of existence, if adopted by a sufficient number of people, would quickly become unsustainable and would lead, literally, to the devouring of the planet. Gandhi was not alone in being granted this insight. Many others were to arrive at the same conclusion, often by completely different routes. But Gandhi occupied a position of unique social and cultural importance. And what was more, he was willing to carry his vision to its logical conclusion by voluntarily renouncing, on behalf of his nation, the kind of power and affluence that is conferred by industrial civilization. This was perfectly well understood by Gandhi's political enemies on the Hindu right, who regarded him as a man who was bent on weakening India. And indeed, it was for this very reason that Gandhi was assassinated by a member of an organization that would later become the nucleus of the political formation that now rules the country. True to form, this coalition came to power by promising exactly what Gandhi had renounced: endless industrial growth. In China, similarly, as your colleague Prasenjit Dwara has shown in Crisis of Global Modernity, industrialism and consumerism faced powerful resistances from within the Taoist, Confucian, and Buddhist traditions. There, too, there were many influential thinkers who understood the implications of large-scale modernization. One such was Zhang Shizhao, who was Minister of Education in Duan Chirui's government. He wrote, While finitude characterizes all things under heaven, appetites alone know no bounds. When the amount of what is of finite supply is gauged on the basis of boundless appetites, the exhaustion of the former can be expected within a matter of days. Conversely, the depletion of finite things would soon come when used to satisfy insatiable desires, unquote. Dwara has shown in rich detail that in both India and China, the resistance to capitalist modernity was overcome very slowly through a range of political and cultural movements that led, over time, I quote, to the Protestantization of religions, secularization, spiritualization, and nation building, unquote. In China, moreover, an awareness of the importance of numbers would lead eventually to the one-child policy, a measure that, at the cost of inflicting great suffering on the people of the country, has had the effect of stabilizing its population at a level far below what it might otherwise have been. Draconian and repressive as this policy undoubtedly is, from the reversed perspective of the Anthropocene, it might well come to be seen one day as the single most significant mitigatory measure enacted anywhere on this planet. For if it is indeed the industrialization of mainland Asia that has accelerated the onset of the present climate crisis, then we may be sure that if several 100 million more consumers had been included in the equation, then the landmark figure of 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would have been passed very much earlier. In any reckoning of climate justice, this history too needs to be taken into account. That in both India and China, the two nations that are now often burdened with the blame for precipitating the climate crisis, there were significant numbers of people who understood, long before climate scientists brought in the data, that industrial civilization was subject to limitations of scale and would collapse if adopted by the majority of the Earth's people. Although they may finally have failed to lead their compatriots in a different direction, they did certainly succeed in significantly retarding the wholesale adoption of a consumerist, industrial model of economy in their countries. In a world where the rewards of a carbon-intensive economy are regarded as wealth, this must be reckoned as a very significant material sacrifice. The demand for climate reparations is therefore founded on unshakable grounds, historically and ethically. Yet, the complexity of the carbon economy's genealogy holds a lesson also for those in the global south who would like to draw a wide and clear line between us and them in relation to global warming. While there can be no doubt that the present climate crisis was in fact brought on by the manner in which the carbon economy evolved in the West, the matter might well have taken many different turns. The climate crisis cannot therefore be thought of as a problem created by an utterly distant other. Humanity might well have tended towards an increasing use of carbon energy, even if the structure of global power had been different. Here then is yet another uncanny aspect of the Anthropocene, that the Earth itself, through its periodic shifts of climate, may have pushed us towards our self-annihilation by playing upon the human proclivity to overreach. It would seem that the planet that nurtured us understood us better than we did ourselves. Thank you. Thank you. So there are microphones, and if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to answer to them as best I can.
Dr. Ghosh, I don't have any question, but I have a few comments to make. When you mention about Brahmaputra Delta, it feels so good to hear that in Chicago, because I grew up right in the bank of the river Brahmaputra. So my house is right down there. And when you talked about the crude oil in Burma, I'm from Assam, which is the northeast part of India. That's where the crude oil was discovered. The British said they discovered it, but it has been used for centuries, actually.
Yeah.
So like they use in the bamboo like the bamboo, different kind of utensils used in bamboo. They use that, and also they dip a special kind of like a seeds, the tea seeds, and they soak the seed and use it as a torch. That has been there used for a long, long time. So that's documented in a history, as well as the tea. I think after the Opium War, British tried to find some tea plantation all over India, but they found it was indigenous to my part of India, so they found it right down there. So tea gardens, and that's another story of slavery, actually. They brought people from the middle part of India and just started the tea industry there. So thank you very much, and it just brought back a lot of memories. And that you said the Burma Oil Company, that is now Indian Oil Corporation and Oil India Limited now. And when I just passed out of engineering college, and I worked there for 6 months. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You're quite right. I mean, I'm sorry, I'd overlooked that oil use in Assam. Just two observations there. One is that, the tea question is very complicated. I mean, it was in exactly this period, the 1830s, that the British did find, wild tea growing wild in Assam, which is not surprising since it's contiguous with Yunnan. But the curious thing is that they didn't believe that this tea would be good. So they went to a great deal of trouble to smuggle tea saplings from China, and they actually smuggled laborers from China to plant the early tea plantations in Assam. Only later did it become transformed into this other. They just didn't believe that Indian tea could be any good. The second thing, Burma Shell, the Burma Shell's Indian operations were nationalized, but Burma Shell itself went on to become Shell Oil, which is today one of the big multinationals. But thank you very much for those comments.
So basically my concern is that, when we talk about modernity,
yes.
I'm here.
Sure.
Probably the thing to look for is not technology, but science itself. So if you consider the difference in the development of the science in different parts of the world, you can clearly make an argument that scientific discourse was predominantly well developed in the Western regions. So you have Newton. If you start directly from Newton, you can go into mechanistic philosophy, and then later on it was supplemented by relativistic and quantum mechanics of the 20th century. And there we can clearly see that the modernity has a lot of roots in modern science, which is predominantly the thought coming from the European regions. So you have to give some I would say, credit to that kind of thought, right? And I would also believe that the ideals of the French and Russian revolutions, they also directly come from the discourse around Spinoza, Descartes, and etc. from modern science. So I think modern science has a lot of role to play here. So what do you have to say about that?
Thank you. That's an important point. I would say 3 or 4 things. One is that, yes, Newton, but if it is the case that, and the possibility exists, that calculus went from Kerala to Europe, then already we see that it's a hybrid process. Newton's thinking also is so dependent on calculus in a sense. Secondly, if you're talking about physics, but the dominant sciences of the 19th and 18th centuries were really the descriptive sciences, such as, say, botany, geology, and so on. And botany was a profoundly hybrid science. Especially, we have such clear evidence of that. The Hortus Malabaricus, written by a Dutch botanist in the 17th century, He depended on an Irava, a local toddy tapper in the Malabar region, to give him the whole catalog of plants. Not only that, actually, it's interesting that in the 17th century, the Hortus Malabaricus, it begins with a preface written by this Irava, I've forgotten his name, written by him and signed by him, saying that I certify that this Dutchman understands what I was trying to teach him. And we see the same sort of hybrid process happening in botany all the time, I'm just giving you Indian examples because these are the ones that I happen to be familiar with, but there are such complex genealogies of technological exchange between the Middle East and Europe and between China and Europe. Really, one of the most interesting things in all of this is actually the resolute sort of concealment of the linkages that occur. And this is something which perhaps has its roots in Descartes' thinking. Because Descartes himself, when Descartes and Bacon come up with this idea of a certain kind of scientific method, they found their idea very fundamentally on the notion of a revolution, of a newness, of a complete break with the past. But it's now very clear that, in fact, a lot of their thinking did derive from medieval scholasticism. And the scholastics were actually quite open to what they were doing. So this is a rhetorical move rather than an actual break. And curiously, we see the same break with the Navanyaya in Bengal, which is also saying that, we are new, Nava meaning new. So those are two of the points that I would make. But the third one is that actually in this case, if you take the question of what creates the possibility of an increasing sort of distance between the West and the rest, it's not so much science in the 19th and late 18th centuries. It's really technology. It's steam technology, which is not a technology arrived at through complex physical theorizing. It's arrived at really by hammer and tongs engineers. And as I say, it would have been very easily reproduced in India, if not for the circumstances of. And this technology actually has the impact over the next 150 years of continuously widening the military gap. And that's what's really crucial, because that's what allows, that's what sets up the whole circumstance of a continuously widening relationship of power. Because, as early as the 16th century, we see that the Bahmani rulers in southern India were implementing, innovating, or copying, shall we say, innovations in military technology made in Italy. Within 10 years of their being made, they were incorporating these. They were producing excellent weaponry. The Chinese copied British weaponry within 2 months of the start of the Opium War. So, I think it's one thing we must reflect on, I think, is really that to what degree is that scientific modernity so as novel as it would like to present itself as? And I really do recommend to you, there's a lot of work now coming out, especially in mathematics, but also on philosophy, where, say, Janardhan Ganeri's work, I think, is particularly striking, where he follows up on, especially, say, logic. Boolean logic is so much derived from the syllogisms of that were occurring in India at that period. Yeah, sure.
I have one in the middle here. You you state a link between the continuation of European imperialism and the timing of the outset of the adoption of a carbon economy. Does the relatively early success of political liberation movements in Latin America pose a possible counterexample to that? Or can we chalk that up to sort of informal American empire?
In Latin America? Yeah. I wish I knew more about Latin America, but I feel unable to comment on that. I just can't comment. Yes? There was a hand up there.
Yeah, there's a couple more questions. There's one woman up here, and then
we'll get one more question after this.
Good evening. I would like to, I don't know if it's a comment or a question, but the point of it is that the invention, technology is more so a friend to human and a foe to the earth.
Okay. See, in England, as well as in China, it now seems to be the case that it was climatic disruptions, which led to the search for new sources of fuel. In England, it was also because of deforestation and so on that people had to find a new source of fuel, and that became coal. But that's the pattern that also seems to have occurred in China. So what can I say? I mean, these are possibilities that can never be proved or disproved. But clearly, one thing is becoming more and more clear, that the interventions of climate in human history have been very important, in ways that we don't recognize, in ways that we don't understand, and in ways that we are only now beginning to understand or even be open to. Why? Not because our thought was leading us there, but because, in a sense, it's the crisis in the atmosphere that has forced us to confront these these possibilities. So once again, we see climate intervening, if you like. Yes, there was a question back there. Over there.
Hi, I had a question that you were talking about, like how math in the West, it couldn't have made advancements without the East's help. So I was wondering, if math had never crossed over, the advancements in math could never have crossed over to the West, how would that have changed Europe's industrialization and its imperialism, and how it could have impacted the entire climate crisis?
Oh my God. There's no possibility of the math not crossing over, because as I said, this is a period when there's such a constant sort of cycling of ideas, such a constant sort of interconnection of ideas, that there's no way that that anybody could have wanted, or indeed would even have wished, to keep these ideas secret. So I think that's a counterfactual that I can't venture into. Thank you.
And now, please, a hearty thank you for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.